Hello everyone and welcome back to the garage. This is part 2 of the restoration series on this Macintosh 128K. As you can see, I have the system still taken apart, but we will get it back together in short order. I finished cleaning all of the internal components, so now we are ready to take a look at everything and give the machine its first proper test. So let's get started. So here's the analog board out of the machine, and as you can see, it looks very good after cleaning it up. There's not a lot of corrosion on this board. There's a little bit on the battery terminals, which is understandable. And looking at the back of the board, you can see there is some corrosion on some of these pads here and in some of the traces. But I believe that these traces are okay, and I can verify that just by putting my meter in continuity mode and testing. And those are fine. So as far as this board is concerned, it's not that bad, but there is a problem on it. This capacitor right here is bulging, so it will need to be replaced. And I do have a cap that matches the value of this one, so I can get that swapped very quickly. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and then we'll take a look at the next board. All right, here's the logic board out of this machine, and I went ahead and cleaned it up, and as you can see, it turned out looking quite nice. It was very dirty before. I took a toothbrush and some isopropyl alcohol and just brushed the whole thing off, and so now it looks a million times better. All the corrosion that was on this board came off. There is some oxidation around some of the chips throughout the board. I see some of it here, there's some over here, but there's nothing I can really do about that. But if I turn this board around, you can see it looks basically pristine on the back. And this is how it looked before I cleaned it as well. So this board is actually in very good shape, and there is a good chance I will be able to get this board working. So I don't see any immediate fault on this board just by looking at it. So what we're gonna do now is take a look at that floppy drive, because that absolutely has to be addressed before I apply power to the machine. All right, let's take a look at this floppy drive. This is the machine's internal floppy drive, so it's important that this drive is working. So to remove it, there's just 4 screws, 2 on each side, and then the drive will come out of this little caddy here. It's somewhat dirty. I've seen way worse. The external floppy drive looked a little bit better, but this one isn't too terrible looking. And this drive has a date on the side. It says September 1984. The external drive had a date of February 1984, so this one's a little bit newer. So the problem with this drive is it's currently in the loaded position, and when you try to move the manual eject, it is frozen solid. So we're gonna have to figure out how we can get that to break free, because that absolutely has to work. Because if it doesn't detect a disk and it's in the loaded position, it'll try to eject, and I don't want it to destroy the eject motor when it tries to do that. So we got to figure out what part of the mechanism here on the side is seized so that we can move it, because this should move very easily and it's just stuck. I don't know how a drive can get that stuck, but apparently it can. So I'm going to go ahead and lubricate this, and we'll just see if things improve. And I can see right here on the top too, we have the same problem that the external drive had, where the piece that opens the floppy disk shutter needs lubricant, because that should rebound immediately and not be super slow like that. And you can see now, after giving that some lubricant, it now rebounds back immediately. And I lubricated all of the points on the side, but the mechanism to eject is still frozen solid. So it's not that. And I thought maybe it's because the motor itself is seized, but I don't think that the manual eject depends on the motor. So it has something to do just with this mechanism itself. I mean, it doesn't move at all. So something is clearly keeping that from moving. I'm gonna have to figure out what that is. Okay, well, I'm moving the little floppy cage, I guess you can call it, the part where the disc sits in, and this moves. So it's not that. It seems like it's just the eject mechanism itself, in which case I'm going to have to basically douse the thing in lubricant to get it free, if that's really what's stuck. That's insane. Like, there's not one bit of movement out of it at all. I mean, I've had drives that needed lubricant, but this is beyond needing lubricant. I mean, this thing needs a whack with a hammer. Ooh. There it is. Hammer always fixes everything. Hey, there we go. Now it's moving. But something's not right because it's not actually ejecting. It's going straight back down. And I wonder if it has something to do with this piece not moving. Okay, yeah, that's it. I was able to move it with the screwdriver and it is like totally gummed up. So I'm gonna have to lubricate that and see if I can get that to even move. Oh, there we go. I was able to push it. And there it is. Now it's actually ejected and it's in the unloaded position. And that piece was very hard to push. So obviously all this old grease in here, I'm gonna have to clean it out because it is what was responsible for seizing up this drive. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. I'm going to lubricate it again and we'll see how it operates when I try to put a disc in it. All right, I've given the drive a light vacuuming, so now I'm more or less comfortable with putting a disc in it. So the first thing I'm gonna do before I do that though, is I'm going to wipe down the head and see if it is dirty. A couple little specks on there, but nothing serious. Around the head though is very filthy, so I'm gonna go ahead and clean that up. All right, now with the head cleaned and the area in the immediate vicinity of the head cleaned, let's stick a 3.5-inch disc in here and we'll see if this needs lubricant. One thing I did lubricate is this little white piece here. This would not move like this before. It got stuck up here, so now this is moving correctly. Seems a little crusty when I move the disc like this, so I'm definitely going to have to clean out the inside of this drive. But let's see if the disk drive actually can load a disc. That's a no. I'm pushing it all the way, and it is not doing a thing. So it's not even moving down. So more lubrication is needed. All right, I figured it out. It is this little piece right here. So when the drive loads itself, this should move up, and then this will move, and it'll go kind of in there like that. Well, this piece wasn't moving at all, so that is why the drive wasn't going down. And so I lubricated it, and as you can see, now it moves. And it took forever for that lubricant to have any effect. So it was obviously gummed up pretty bad. It probably took about 20 minutes of just moving it. And then finally it started to actually work. And so now I should be able to load a disc perfectly fine in this drive. So we'll just do a little test here with this disc. There it is. And it popped out nice because this has been lubricated. There we go. That loads very nicely. So all this drive needs now is just to be cleaned up a little bit more, clean off the excess lubricant, and it should be good to go. So this drive should now work when it's installed in the machine. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this thing cleaned up. I'll get it put back in the caddy, and then we'll go ahead and reassemble the Macintosh to a point where we can test it, and we'll see how everything works. All right, so this is what the metal chassis looks like after I did my best to clean as much of the corrosion and rust off as I could. As you can see, it's better, but it's still got quite a bit of gunk on it, and unfortunately that is as good as it's going to get unless I were to like sandblast the thing and repaint it with some conductive material. So it's definitely better. I gave the cover, the front cover and the back cover a complete wash, so now they are perfectly clean, and I cleaned up everything else inside the system. So at this point, we're ready to put the motherboard back in, hook up the floppy drive and the analog board connector, and let's give this machine a test. All right, this machine is ready to be plugged into power for the first time, so let's apply power to it. 3, 2, 1. Okay, nothing happened. That is good. Now, let's flip the power switch on the back. That's promising. And we do indeed have a sad Mac error. And as you can see, we do have an error code, 040040. So I don't have the Macintosh error codes memorized, so I'm gonna have to look that up and see what that code means. One thing I am noticing though is that this monitor is very bright and is quite crisp even at the highest brightness level. So this machine must not have a ton of time on it because the monitor looks very nice. So once we get this thing booted up into the operating system, then we'll be able to see what the monitor actually looks like. So let me go look up that error code and let's see what that tells us. All right, I have figured out what that specific error code means. So on this website, we can see the original Mac 128K, 512K, and Plus error code description. So the error code was 6 characters long, 040040, and it says the first 2 characters are the class code. So the first 2 characters that we are seeing was 04. So number 4, that means the memory test mod 3 test failed. So that's just a specific way that it's testing the RAM chips, and that test failed. So we do know that this computer does indeed have a memory error, and we can see that the next 4 characters are the subcode. So those 4 characters were 0040. And so if we look, here's 0040 right here, and we can see that the affected data bit is data bit 6, and that will be the RAM chip at location F11. And so on the motherboard, it's laid out really nicely, and so that chip is very easy to find. So let me show you what that looks like on the motherboard. So at the motherboard out of the machine, you can see along the sides of it, we have rows A through G and columns 1 through 13. So the RAM test is telling us that chip F11 is bad. So if we go to row F and we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, this is the chip that needs to be replaced. And these chips here are the RAM chips. So this one needs to be replaced. So once you know what the error code means, it's pretty simple to zero in on the bad chip. So I ordered some more of these style RAM chips, and they are on the way and coming very soon. So once I get those, we can replace that bad chip, and then we'll see if the board is able to boot after that. While we wait for those RAM chips to arrive, one thing I want to do now is I want to test out these floppy disks and test the external floppy drive. And as you can see, I was able to clean these disks, and now they look a lot better. They're not perfect, but they're a million times better than how they started. But unfortunately, there's a couple discs here that I'm going to have to write off as permanently damaged. The first one being the guided tour to MacWrite and MacPaint. This disc has a problem I've never seen before. So on 3.5-inch floppy drives, the drive itself will latch into these 2 little holes here on this rotating part of the disc. And when it rotates, the disk media will rotate along with this piece because it's attached to it. Well, I was rotating this piece with my hand, and the disk media is not moving. It has come free of this piece. So this can still rotate, but the disk media won't rotate. So this disk will not work. The other one that's not going to work is one of the PFS file disks, and it doesn't have the problem where the disk media has come free, so that is still working. But if you take a look inside and look at the disk media, it's got mold all over the disk. So this is not going to work. But I did take a look at the other PFS file disk. On the back of these disks, there is a little part number here, and it's the same on both disks. So the other PFS file disk is not moldy, so I think it'll work. I think this is just a duplicate disk. So if this works, then I'm not going to worry about this one because this is the exact same disk. The other disks here have a chance at working. The media itself on the backside, because that's where the head is quite scratched on some of the disks, so I imagine we're going to have some problems, but these are the ones that have a chance of working, and that includes the game, the PFS file, the other unlabeled disk, the system disk. Hopefully this works. If not, it's not a big deal because I have some 800K disks that I can format as single-sided disks, so I can still make a bootable disk even if none of these work. The MacPaint disk and then this other unlabeled disk. Now, the 2 beige unlabeled disks I know for sure are Apple disks because if I rotate a labeled one around, right here it says made in Japan, and on this one it also says made in Japan, and the disc markings are basically identical between the 2. So I know that the 2 unlabeled discs that look like this are Apple disks. So I imagine one of them is going to be Mac write. So let's go ahead and hook up that external floppy drive to a different machine, and then we can test these disks and test the drive and see if they work. All right, I have the drive hooked up to my Macintosh SE, so now we can test it along with the disks and see if things work properly. So before we test out the disk drive, what I want to do is I want to stick one of the disks into the internal drive here because I know it works. So if we do have a bad disk, we can rule out that it's actually the disk and not a drive problem. So let's start with the Mac system disk, because this is the one I really want to see working. So let's go ahead and see if this is a good disk. The disk is unreadable. Okay, so that tells me it is not a good disk. Now I do know that this machine's internal drive is good, but because we had a disk failure, I'm going to have to check it now with a blank Mac formatted disk. And this is a high density disk, which will work in this machine because this is a later Mac SE Super Drive model. So it is able to read high density disks, and as you can see, it read the disk just fine. So we have a bad original Macintosh system disk. So let's go down the line and see if we have any disk that is able to work. So the next one we'll try is Mac Paint. Ooh, we do have a working disk here. I'm surprised this disk is working because this was the dirtiest one out of all of them. So having this disk be good is actually really cool. And as you can see, there we have Mac Paint, the program right there. So let's try to launch it. It does sound like it's having a little bit of trouble, so maybe this disk is marginal. Oh, it did launch though. There we go. And there's someone's previous file that they were made called Rescue. Let's see what version of Mac Paint this is. Mac Paint version 1.4 from 1983. Now what I'll go ahead and do real quick is change the disk label because they have it as .m. So I'm going to change it so that it says Mac Paint. Okay, now this is cool. I just opened one of the files on the Mac Paint disk called Quilt, and as you can see, it has a very fancy design, probably made for a quilt back in the 80s. And this will actually be a really good test file for when we test the printer later on, and we'll see if it's able to print this, because that would look really cool on paper. So because the Mac Paint disk is working, we can put that disk in the external drive here, and we'll see if it works. So let's take a look. Yep, it's spinning. Doesn't sound very good, but it is spinning. The disk is unreadable, so maybe we do have a bad external drive. So let's eject it. We'll see if the eject works. I don't think it did. No, it did not. So the eject doesn't work. That's wonderful. We'll have to eject it like that. So let's go through the rest of the disks here and we'll see what works and what doesn't. So now we're going to try one of the unlabeled disks, and we're going to have to test these on the machine's internal drive because the external one is not working. Okay, that one works. Oh, you know what? This might be a system disk because we have system here, we have the disk copy program, and we also have the base files needed for the Mac to operate, as well as an empty folder. This was a thing in very early macOS releases. Before the HFS file system, you could not actually create a new folder on the disk. It would always give you an empty one. So whenever you change the name of the empty folder, it will automatically generate a new empty folder, and that is how it made new folders. So that is why there's an empty folder there. This will actually be empty, as you can see. But yeah, it looks like this disk is actually the system disk. So I'm going to rename this to system disk. Now we'll do another unlabeled disk. Guided tour. Okay, this one is working. Oh, this is the guided tour to Macintosh disk. As you can see, we have Mousing Around and Amazing, both of which are programs I know come off the guided tour to Macintosh disk. So that's cool to have working. Let's open the Amazing program. This is a maze game program, and we'll see if it launches. It sure does. Let's see, how does this work? Oh, you drag with the mouse. Okay, so that's cool. We have a little maze game that we can test once we get the original Mac 128K up and running. So that's cool that this works. Okay, now we'll try out the PFS file disk that is not moldy. That does not sound promising. Oh, it did come up though. There we go, PFS file. And we do have a system folder on this thing, so this is actually a bootable disk. Let's open PFS file. Yep, there we go. So this disk is actually good. All right, and the final disk is Sargon 3. So let's go ahead and put this in and see if it works. It does, and it actually has some programs set on the desktop. Looks like this might be some sort of chess game. I'm gonna open the disk itself. We have a system, so that means this is bootable. I am just going to put these icons back into the disk, and I'm going to rename it. So now we'll open it up here, and we will launch the program. A system error occurred, coprocessor not installed. So maybe this program's a little bit too new for this computer. I have experienced that with some older programs. They don't really want to run even on a Mac SE. This is running System 6, but obviously this is a little bit too new for that program, but the disk works, so that's good. We'll just wait for this to reboot here. And just for the heck of it, I'm gonna put it in the external drive and just see if it's able to even read it. I doubt it. Wait for the machine to finish booting up here. Nope, that drive is not good, so we are going to have to fix two problems with it. Not able to read disks, and the eject doesn't work. Because it should have ejected right there, so once it comes up with the message again, I will eject it. So now what I'm gonna do is, because all of the other disks actually worked, I'm gonna see if I can revive this disk. So I'm gonna stick it in here. Now it says it's unreadable, but I'm gonna try to initialize it as a one-sided disk. So go ahead and see if this machine is able to format it. And if so, I'm going to make this disk the system disk, because it's got the label on it. So I'm gonna name it system disk. And we'll see if it's able to format it. Nope, that failed right away. So obviously this disk is bad at the very first track, because it would have tried if the disk was not bad. So we have one bad disk. Well, we actually have three bad disks. A moldy one that won't turn right, and one that actually just failed normally. So out of that, we have 5 good disks. So that is good. All right, I have the machine's motherboard elevated up in this little board holder, so it'll make it easier for me to desolder the chip and get it out. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna remove this RAM chip using hot air. So I went ahead and I taped off the surrounding section of the motherboard with some Kapton tape, and this is heat resistant tape, so that when I put the heat gun over the solder joints of the RAM chip, those are the only ones that are going to melt. But before we replace the RAM chip, I did figure out that that external 400 kilobyte drive does not work in machines that have a high density floppy controller. And I'm sure there are a few of you that were screaming at your screens like, it's not going to work in that Mac SE, because my Mac SE is a SuperDrive model, so it has a high density floppy controller. If I had one of the earlier Mac SEs that had an 800K drive, that external drive would likely have worked. So the only way we're going to be able to test that external drive is on this machine. So we have to get that repaired first. So I'm going to use hot air to melt all the solder joints of this chip, and I'm probably going to have some pliers or something on the other side of it just so I can pull it out, because the legs on the chip are kind of bent, so it's not just going to fall right out. So I'm going to go ahead and get that done. And there it is. There is the RAM chip. And here's what that looks like on the top of the board. You can see the RAM chip has been removed. So what I'm going to do for that RAM chip, just in case I have to replace it again, is I'm going to install a socket. So that will solder directly into the board, and then I can put the RAM chip directly in the socket so that if I need to replace it again, I don't have to desolder it. So I'm going to go ahead and clean all of the residual solder out of the holes for the RAM chip legs. I'll install a socket and put in a new RAM chip, and we'll see if the computer works after that. All right, the socket has been installed into the motherboard, so now we are ready to put a RAM chip in it. But one thing you do want to make sure is that when you're soldering the socket in, I soldered it right there, if your motherboard has traces on this side as well, it doesn't have to be a Macintosh board, but any board that you're putting a chip socket into, if there are traces on the other side of the board as well, when you're soldering it on the back, you kind of want to hold your iron there for a second just to ensure that the solder is making it from one side of the board to the other. And so I did that when soldering in this socket, because there are traces on this side of the board, and I can see solder on every single pad on the upper side of the board, so that should be fine. So what we can go ahead and do now is install one of the new RAM chips that I bought. So here's a new RAM chip. So we'll go ahead and install it in the correct direction. And there we go. New RAM chip installed. So let's put this motherboard back in the machine and we'll see if it works now. All right, the motherboard is hooked up back in the machine. So let's go ahead and turn on the power and see if the machine will start up now. Look at that, that fixed it. All right, I've gone ahead and hooked up the trackball to the machine, so now we can move the mouse if the trackball works. So let's go ahead and turn the machine on again. So as you can see, we do have a working system now. Let's move the trackball and see if the pointer moves. It sure does, but that is not correct. I'm moving it to the right now, and it is not moving to the right. Up and down is working, but left and right is having some trouble. So I am going to have to take a look inside the trackball and see if I can get that working. But what we can do now is, since the system has started, I can put a disk in the drive and we'll see if the internal drive works. So I'm going to put in the Sargon 3 disk because I think it had a system folder on it. So let's see if this works. That crashed it immediately. Well, you know what it might be doing? I noticed that this machine had the earlier Mac 128K ROMs in it, but it had a newer revision of the floppy drive, and I don't think that this version of the floppy drive will work inside a machine with early ROMs. So I think that's why it's crashing. And I noticed that the drive mechanism inside the external enclosure is an older version. So I think what I'm going to do is swap the external drive mechanism into the internal caddy on this machine, and then we'll go ahead and try that again. Never mind. I found the problem. Watch what happens when I wiggle the connector on the motherboard that goes to the analog board. See, the video goes in and out. So we have a loose connection on the motherboard where the connector goes. So I'm going to go ahead and take the motherboard out, reflow that, and we will go from there. Okay, we're still having the same problem. All right, third time is the charm. Third time is not the charm. Yeah, you know what? I think it might be on the analog board side, because now I'm wiggling it up more toward the top and it's going in and out. Let's stick the disc in there again, and I want to see if this thing attempts to boot from the disc or if it gives me an error code, because if the drive that's inside this machine is too new, then it will give an error code when it tries to read the disc. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of put this in a position where it'll have video. That's going to be easier said than done. Like that. Let's see what it does. It's not doing anything, actually. The drive's connected, but it's just not doing anything. Well, first things first, I'm going to reflow the video connector so that I don't have to hold the wire like that. And then we'll see if we can get this thing to boot. All right, I reflowed that connector on the analog board, and now it is fine. I can wiggle the wire and the video does not disappear. So that is now fixed. I'm going to go ahead and put that disc in again, and let's just see what happens. Absolutely nothing. So that could be either a problem with the floppy drive, or it could be a problem with the motherboard. So there's plenty of things that could make it so that the floppy drive doesn't work. But what we can do is we can hook up the external drive, since that one did run, and we'll see if we can boot up a disk out of that drive. I can see that the internal drive is alive because the little LEDs that are for the disk sensors are lit. So it's not like the drive is dead. It just isn't doing anything when I put the disk in there. So let me hook up the external drive and we'll see what we can get going. Okay, the external drive is hooked up just off to the side, so let's turn on the machine again. I heard it reset. So I'm going to put a disk in the external drive, the Sargon 3 disk, and we'll see if we get a booting system. It's trying. Oh, the eject worked. So maybe that's not a boot disk. It gave me the X, so either the drive isn't able to read the disk, or that disk doesn't have a system folder on it. Let's try a different disk. Okay, try one more disk. Yeah, the drive is not working because that was the Mac Paint disk, and I know the Mac Paint disk is good. So obviously we are still facing problems with the machine. The external drive works, but it's not able to read disks. The internal drive doesn't do anything at all. And that could just be because it's the newer model of drive. I'm not sure. All right, I have found the problem with the internal floppy drive. As you can see, I have a disk in it. That's the Mac Paint disk. I got it to boot. And I was able to do that because I figured out there's actually a broken piece inside the drive. If you look in the external drive, right there, you see that little black peg? Well, that is for one of the floppy disk sensors. The disk will push that down when it goes down. But when I had the disk removed from this drive, if we look in there, that little peg has broken right off of the floppy disk sensor. So when the disk goes in, it is not pushing that sensor down. And so that's why it did nothing, because I put the disk in and then I used a little paper clip to push that sensor down. The drive started spinning and it booted right up into Mac Paint. So the internal drive is working. I just need to figure out how I'm going to get that sensor to work. I'm going to go ahead and think about what I'm going to do for that internal drive, and then I will come back with what I'm going to do. All right, I went ahead and made a little spot for the Macintosh to sit so that it can be set up with its keyboard and trackball. So what I did to fix the internal drive is, as you can see in there now, I 3D printed a little peg that the disk will push down, and so when the disk goes in the drive, it will push the sensor and the system will be able to boot. Now, as you can see, it's quite a bit bigger than the original peg, You can see in the external drive, the peg is right there, right at the edge of my finger. So that's what the original looks like. So the one that I printed is quite a bit bigger. So how I got this to work is I printed that little piece and then I super glued it right to the position where the original peg was. And so I waited a few hours for that to dry, and the internal drive does work now. So I will show you that in action. So we'll go ahead and turn the system on here. Now I have noticed that both drives, sometimes when you put a disk in them, they won't spin. So we'll see if it will spin this time. Yes, it does. So because the drive is spinning, we know that the sensor got pushed down. So as you can see, now the internal drive is working and it is able to boot the operating system. And as you can see, we just finished booting up. So the only problems that we still have to work on are the trackball left and right still doesn't work. Up and down is fine. The external floppy drive doesn't read disks. And then we also have to clean up the printer and test that to see if it works. So it seems like all the issues inside the computer itself are now fixed because the floppy drive works, we don't have any more RAM problems, and the system is able to start up normally. And that is going to be it for part 2. We managed to get the Macintosh, the system itself, to be 100% working. So the only things we still left to do are, first thing, fix the trackball so that we can actually use the system, clean up the printer, plug it in and see if it works. And then I think I'll save the external floppy drive for last because now we have a working internal drive. I was able to test the keyboard. I was able to use the up and down movement of the trackball to open the keycaps program, which I kind of use as like a keyboard test program. And so I tested all the keys and each one of them worked. So the keyboard is working fine. So in part 3, first we'll take a look at the trackball, then we'll see if we can get the printer to work, and then we'll take a look at the external floppy drive to see if we can get that working. I don't know if we're going to do all of that in part 3, but for sure we're going to take a look at the trackball and the printer. So look forward to that, and I will see you in my next video.